Chapter 8. The tiny car raced down the freeway. Owen took the first exit and was now on a lonely highway. "Give me the orb," he called to Doug and Curtis. Curtis handed it to him. Owen drove with one hand on the wheel, the other rubbing the orb's surface. It rumbled for a second, then quieted and dimmed. "You were right," he said to Curtis. "This was on the whole time. It was acting like a beacon or something." "Is that how your friend found us?" Curtis asked. "I think so. He can't follow us now, though." "How do you know?" "Because I turned it off." "Are you sure this time?" "Yes." This time, Owen was certain. He could feel that the orb was turned off. They drove for a few minutes in silence. Owen wasn't sure where he was going, but he recognized the area. There was a mountain on the right, black against the dark blue sky. If he remembered correctly, they were close to Colin's house. "Hey, man, I think we should stop. Doug is hurt pretty bad." Owen looked back and saw a huge gash on Doug's forehead. It was bleeding freely. Curtis was trying to stop it by pressing his shirt against the wound. Owen faced the road again. It was nearly 4 in the morning, and there was only one place he could think to go now. The neighborhood brought back a flood of memories as Owen drove through it. He remembered all the times he came here as a kid to play kickball in the middle of the street with Colin and the other kids. Owen fondly remembered Andy Harrison, who used to live down the street from Colin. Everyone used to call him Fart Master, though the kid only farted once in their presence. The name just sounded silly and made everyone laugh. As he made his way effortlessly through the neighborhood's winding roads, Owen recognized everything as if he'd last seen it yesterday instead of 2 years ago. He turned left onto Eagle Mountain Court, which rose upward. At the end of the road was a 1-story house on a small hill. The driveway rose upward toward the garage on the side of the house. Fake spider webbing was spread over the bushes in front. The Matthews residence. Owen parked in the street in front of the house. There was a big silver Ford truck parked in the driveway along with a blue SUV next to it. He wondered if Colin still lived here. His heart raced, worrying that Colin may have moved. There was a light shining through thin curtains from a bay window by the front door. Someone was awake. Everyone got out of the car except Dee. Owen told him to stay and that he would come back for him later. Curtis helped Doug up the hilly front yard. Owen walked ahead of them. He wanted to see who was up and about in the living room through the curtain. Studying the truck, he wondered if it was Colin's or his father's. It was a newer model. He walked slowly to the window and looked in. He could see inside pretty well, but no one was visible. The light was coming from a desk lamp right next to the window. He looked back to Doug and Curtis and gave them a shrug. Curtis gave an exaggerated shrug back. "What does this mean?" "I think you guys should stay out of view for now," Owen said, pointing to the cut on Doug's forehead and the blood on his and Curtis's shirts. Owen himself was relatively presentable. He went to the front door, which had a large Halloween pumpkin sticker on it, and knocked gently while Doug and Curtis stood over by the silver truck. A full minute went by and no one answered. He knocked harder. The front porch light came on, startling him. The door opened and a young, dark-haired woman stood before him. She looked irritated. "Can I help you?" she asked. Owen looked at the others by the truck, then back again to the woman. "Is Colin Matthews home?" She stared for a moment before saying, "1 moment, please." She closed the front door again. Owen stood there, waiting. It was getting pretty chilly. A minute later, the door opened again, and a tall young man was there, looking groggy. "Can I help you?" he asked. Owen stared at the man for a moment, not saying anything. He looked familiar, yet different. He had short brown hair and green eyes. His lashes were very thick and dark, his eyebrows thin, as if waxed. "Colin?" Owen said carefully. The man studied him for a long second, and then realization dawned on him. "Owen?" Owen smiled. "Yeah, it's me." "Holy crap!" the young man yelled and hugged him. "Where the hell have you been, man? It's been years." "Oh, seeing the sights." It was like old times. Owen could feel the huge smile on his own face. His friend let him go and studied him again. "Well, come in, damn it. We're letting the bugs in." Owen hesitated. "I have a couple of friends out here, too." Colin saw Doug and Curtis standing by the truck. "Why are they so beat up?" "I'll explain later. One of them needs some first aid. Is it okay if they come in?" Colin nodded absently, still staring at them. Doug sat on the toilet while Curtis tended to his cut forehead. Owen stood outside the bathroom, watching. Colin was right behind him. "What happened?" he asked Owen. "We had a car accident on the way here." It wasn't a complete lie. Owen could feel his friend's eyes on him, so he turned to face Colin. Colin was smiling in disbelief. "I can't believe you're here," Colin said. "We thought you were dead. We put flyers up and everything. Pictures of your dumb self were everywhere." "Really? Flyers? No FBI?" Owen grinned. "I was in San Sebastian." "Oh, snap! Really? The city? Were you kidnapped?" "No, I walked there myself." Colin stood there, still grinning. He shook his head in astonishment. "Why did you leave?" Owen thought about what to say. His memories of living here with Colin and his dad were pretty murky. He mostly only remembered actually getting up and leaving. "I don't really know." The young woman who'd answered the door was standing in the middle of the hallway, studying them nervously. Owen stared at her. Colin noticed and turned. "Babe, I want you to meet someone," he said to her. She walked up to Colin and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Honey," Colin said, "I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine, Owen Walters." She shook Owen's hand, warming to him a little. "Nice to meet you. Colin's told me all about you." "Owen, this is my wife Vanessa." "Wife?" Owen asked, stunned. "You're married?" "You bet your life I'm married." "But you're only 18. I mean, congratulations. I just wasn't expecting that." Colin smiled. "Yeah, well, I was only 16 the last time you saw me. All we cared about back then were video games and toys. But we all have to grow up sometime." Owen checked on the two in the bathroom. Curtis managed to get Doug's head bandaged and was now tending to his own cuts. "Car accident, you say?" Vanessa asked, concerned. "Yeah, not too far from here." "Well, why didn't you go to the hospital?" she asked, not unkindly. Just curious. "We didn't think the damage was that bad." Owen felt a little uncomfortable as he realized how he was imposing on Colin's life. He hadn't been thinking clearly when he decided to come here. He hadn't even thought for 1 second that Colin would have a wife. "I'm studying to be a nurse," Vanessa said. "I could look at your friend's cuts." I think they would appreciate that, Owen said with a smile. Vanessa walked past him and joined Doug and Curtis. Do you wax your eyebrows? Owen finally asked Colin. He had to know. Colin rubbed them and laughed. Hell yeah, I do. Don't you remember what they used to look like? Bushy as hell. Owen took in Colin's appearance. Besides the waxed eyebrows, he also had earrings and a large tattoo of a cross on his back. He had changed a lot over the years. Is your dad here? Owen asked, looking around. I hope we didn't wake him. He died a year ago. Owen gasped. Oh, I'm sorry. You remember that lake you and I used to fish in? Colin asked. Owen nodded, though he didn't really remember. Well, one night, me and Jake Ryan, you remember him? Snuck out and went fishing there. When we came back, Dad was lying on the floor with a phone in his hand. He'd had a heart attack while I was gone. Owen was too stunned to respond. He remembered Colin's dad, Martin, fairly well. The man had never been very friendly. Colin, I'm really sorry. He'd always had a bad heart. It took me a while to get over it. I mean, sure he was my dad, but he was always a jerk, remember? Owen nodded. Then he thought of his own father, who was also dead. But with death came life. Vanessa and I had a baby a few weeks after Dad died. A girl. Owen's eyes widened. Marriage was one thing, but a baby? That's great, he said, and meant it. Wow, man. You really are grown up. Yep, Colin said proudly. And that truck out there, I bought it myself. Now Owen was starting to feel inferior. He pretty much had nothing to claim as his own. Alyssa had bought everything when she was still alive. So, what's your daughter's name? Owen asked, not wanting to think of Alyssa. Sydney Alyssa, Colin said. Owen thought he would scream at that moment. Colin had named his daughter Alyssa. What were the odds? Doug, Curtis, and Vanessa came out of the bathroom, and they all made their ways to the living room. Owen, Curtis, and Doug sat down on the couch. Vanessa and Colin in the chairs across from them. An awkward silence washed over the room, a ticking clock the only sound. Owen couldn't find the clock, however. Was anyone else involved in the accident? Vanessa asked. The trio exchanged glances. No, Curtis said. We just ran off the road. Vanessa nodded, though she didn't look as relieved as Owen had hoped. He was well aware of the perfectly good car he had decided to park right in front of the house, and that Vanessa may have seen it. So, where are you guys headed? Colin asked. My old house, Owen said. The farm. Colin's lovingly waxed eyebrows drew together in confusion. Why are you going there? I wanted to show my friends where I grew up. Why? Is someone else living there? Not that I know of. More silence. Hey, have you guys heard about any giants roaming the area? Doug suddenly asked. Owen elbowed him in the ribs. Vanessa and Colin exchanged glances. No, she said. Now that you're back in town, Colin began, I guess you'll want to visit your dad. Owen shot Colin a sharp look. My dad? Yeah. Owen looked to Doug and Curtis as if hoping they'd confirm what Colin just said. They were just as wide-eyed as Owen. My dad's dead, Colin. Colin didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at his wife nervously. Yeah, his grave, I mean. I know he's dead, silly. Brain cancer sucks. Trying to process what he was hearing, Owen remained silent. Brain cancer? He'd seen his father, Russell Walters, get struck by a meteor 2 years ago. "Are you all right?" Cullen asked. Owen nodded, looking at the floor. "My dad didn't have brain cancer. He was killed by a meteor." "Why do you think that?" Cullen asked. "Because I saw him die. At least, I thought I did." "You must have a funky memory, because I heard it was a tumor that killed him." "Who told you that?" Owen asked, looking at Cullen now. "My dad." Owen shook his head. He wasn't refusing to believe what he was hearing, but he was finding it difficult to accept. "That's why you came to live with us, remember? After that thing that happened at your farm?" Cullen had to be referring to the meteor shower that Owen, up until now, believed killed his father. Owen could remember vividly the field lighting up where his father stood, the house shaking as if experiencing an earthquake. "You do remember that, don't you?" Cullen asked. Owen nodded again. "Are you okay?" Vanessa asked. "Yes, this is just a lot to process. All this time." "What happened that night, Owen?" Cullen asked. An awkward pause. Then, "What do you mean?" "Well, when the police got out to your place, your dad was dead inside the house. You were lying on the stairs, right in front of him. You don't remember?" Owen didn't remember any of that. Was Cullen serious? If not, then why would he make that up? But Owen had a completely different recollection of the events that night. He remembered his father looking into the sky as it lit up, and Owen clearly remembered the meteor crashing right where his father had stood. And now Cullen was telling him that other things had happened, stuff that Owen didn't remember. "Do you know your family's mental health history?" Vanessa asked. Owen shook his head absently. He couldn't remember anything about his family. As far as he knew, his father was the only family he had. His mother had left them a year before Russell's death, according to what his father had told him. Living on a farm hadn't agreed with her. "What all do you remember?" Cullen asked. "Do you remember your time here, when you moved in with Dad and me?" "A little," Owen said. "I thought I was staying here because my dad died." Owen trailed off, so Cullen spoke. "Yeah, dude, you stayed here because of that. Then, after only a few weeks, you disappeared. It was scary." "Did a meteor actually hit our farm?" Owen asked desperately. "I don't know. I mean, there was a crater on your land, but no one could actually find any pieces of the meteor. A lot of people saw it in the sky that night, though." Owen thought about it. Doug and Curtis were whispering to each other conspiratorially, probably talking about the giant they'd encountered on the freeway. Everyone was silent for a while. Then a baby's cry broke in, startling them. Vanessa got up and said nothing as she left the living room. Cullen stared at Owen without a word. Owen held the white flyer in his hand, his 14-year-old self staring back at him. This was one of the flyers Cullen had talked about earlier. "Have you seen this boy?" was written just above the picture. He'd found it in a drawer in the kitchen. There were quite a few stacked in there. Apparently, the Matthewses had made more than they had given out. Someone walked up to Owen, but he didn't look to see who it was. "I'm glad you're back," Cullen said. Owen nodded, still staring at the flyer. He hated himself for leaving. The worst part was not even knowing why he'd left in the first place. He tried to remember back to that night, but couldn't. Not right now. "I have someone here I want you to meet," Cullen added. Owen turned around and saw his friend holding a baby in his arms. Colin had changed into camouflage shorts and a white, long-sleeved shirt. It had been nearly 10 minutes since he'd gotten up to join Vanessa in the back of the house, where the bedrooms were. Owen smiled and stepped closer. The baby was wrapped in a pink blanket and stared sleepily at him. Owen touched her tiny hand, and she grabbed his finger. "She's adorable. Congratulations." "Thanks." She was about 2 weeks late. The wife was in agony. It was hard to believe that Colin was a husband and a father, even though Owen was seeing it with his own eyes. His childhood friend was a man now, and Owen himself still felt like a kid. "Luckily today's my day off. I work for the airlines over in Custer." Colin sat down at the dining table, feeding Sydney a bottle of formula. "So, tell me what you've been doing all these years." Owen sat down across from him. "There's not much to tell," Owen lied. "I made a few friends there, and we got a condo together." He left out the part where he and his friends fought monsters and saved the world from 2 evil brothers. "A condo? Nice. That's something." "I guess it is." "Meet any hot chicks in the city?" Owen shook his head. He was almost ashamed of the fact that he hadn't even tried to meet any girls. "You're still a virgin, aren't you?" Colin suddenly asked. Owen laughed but didn't answer. He was feeling more inferior by the second. While he had been off fighting monsters and losing his friends, Colin was living life. He was bettering himself and taking care of a family. "When did you lose yours?" Owen asked. "When I was 16, Colin answered, looking down at Sydney. She was almost done with her bottle. 16? Owen was shocked. "Yeah, it was with Vanessa. We started going out after you disappeared. She used to live right down the street. Well, one night she came over, and one thing led to another." Owen shook his head. "Shame on you," he said with a grin. "Yeah, I wouldn't recommend losing one's virginity at that age. It wasn't worth it." A fairly comfortable silence filled the kitchen. "So, tell me about your lovely wife," Owen finally said. Colin smiled. "Well, she's almost a nurse. She's the greatest woman I've ever known." "Did you get married before or after she got pregnant?" Owen wasn't sure why he asked that, and he regretted it soon after. "Why are you really here?" Colin asked, ignoring the question. "I don't know," Owen answered truthfully. He wanted to know about the orb, and he'd figured the answers would be at his old farmhouse, but how would he explain that to Colin? "Some strange things have happened," Owen continued. "I think my dad might have been involved with them." "What things?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Colin stared at Owen in silence for a while, nodding his head and rocking Sydney in his arms. "You want to hold her?" Owen nodded and smiled as Colin placed the baby in his arms. "Wow, she's heavy." "Yep, 10 pounds, 10 ounces when she was born. You think you'll ever have kids?" Colin asked. Owen thought for a moment before saying, "No, kids aren't for me." "Guys!" Curtis yelled from the living room. "Come see this!" Colin, Owen, and Vanessa ran into the living room and saw Doug and Curtis watching the TV. The news was on. There was shaky footage of a city street, cars lined up bumper to bumper. People were standing outside of these cars, staring at something just off screen. Finally, the camera turned, and at the end of the street was something large and blue. The cameraman had zoomed in way too much. The camera pulled back, bringing the thing into focus. Everyone in the living room gasped. It was a giant blue man. He was staring at the crowd in the streets before him, at the cameraman. It was an incredibly disturbing sight. "I told you I saw a giant," Doug said, practically breathless. Owen didn't notice, though. He was too busy recognizing the street where this was taking place. The blue man was in downtown San Sebastian, standing in front of the parking garage that he and Chris had destroyed the other day. The blue man turned his back on the gathering crowd and started picking through the rubble. It looked like it was searching for something. The cameraman got closer to the giant, trying to make his way through the crowd. The sound was turned down on the TV, and no one thought to turn it up. They only watched as the events unfolded before them. As the camera got a closer look, the giant's features became more pronounced. It looked to Owen like a giant naked man, but instead of being flesh-covered, he was blue and appeared to be made of stone. He was picking up a huge piece of rubble and holding it over his head. He let out a piercing roar and hurled the rubble into the street, toward the cameraman. Suddenly, the video feed died.